Well, you know what they say, when you fall off the horse, the best thing to do is make a new knife so you can exact your revenge. Howdy and welcome back to the workshop. In today's episode, I've got a knife planned that I am super stoked for. I did an original design for this knife like a year ago, almost a full year ago, and I've been really excited about it ever since then. So first things first, let's dig into designing this knife. Now, the main concept points of this knife is that I really wanted to have a double ground swept plunge fighter. And that swept plunge means that rather than it being a sharp radius, the kind of lines where the blade transitions into the ricasso has these kind of swoopy doopy lines. I really like how those look. And those swoopy plunge lines happen to match a handle transition that I've done a handful of times on pieces. And I think that's gonna look really nice, have a nice kind of flow and symmetry with it, and just be a good reflective transition from blade to handle. Now, the grind line, the transition between the back edge and the front edge will also very nicely match that handle facet that I do on almost all of my knives. And so overall, it's gonna have a very balanced, matched, symmetrical feel to the knife, which is the reason that I'm so dang excited to make it. I'll be using some 2-inch wide by almost 8-inch long 1080 and 15N20 I got from the Alex Steel Co. This stuff I'll stack up heavy 1080 on one side and then a few alternating pieces on the other. Once the billet is tacked together, I'll weld on some sheet metal onto the sides of the stack where the open layers could let in some oxygen and cause a bad forge weld if you're not careful. I'm gonna take the first heat on my big Baudry. I can get full contact along the width of the dies, and that means that it's gonna be squishing together nice and even the whole way around. So after I get those welds set, I throw it back in the fire and let it soak. The soaking really helps promote a good forge weld. As far as I understand it, it promotes cross-boundary grain growth, because basically as steel heats up, the crystalline grain structure inside of it grows. And so once you've got it forge welded, you let it get nice and hot and stay that way for a long time. That grain grows, and ideally it grows across the boundary of your forge welds, making it stronger. Once the layers are stuck together, I grind off the sheet metal on the sides so I don't forge it into the final billet. Now after I forge weld this, we'll round out the bar and then squish it down in the opposite direction from where the layers were stacked. That'll give us our C shape, and I'm gonna forge that down really thin so I can stack it up again 8 or 10 times before having to re-weld. I'll just draw that bar out nice and thin. Okay, so I may or may not have, but definitely did, totally biff this in the most amateur of ways. I began to squish down my now round 8.5 pound billet in the wrong direction, which gives you straight layers and not the C shape, which is the base for W's that I was after. Fortunately, I was able to re-squish it back in the other direction and save most of the bar. That along with the other half that I hadn't squished yet, we should have plenty of steel for the pattern, but I've got 2 different sizes of bar. One is 400 thousandths of an inch thick by 1.4 inches wide. One is 1/4 of an inch or 250 thousandths of an inch by 1.4 inches wide. Let's chop up our ends and see how our patterns on both of these look. If all turns out well, then having a thinner C shape and a thicker C shape will actually look pretty good and give it kind of some cool organicness, I suppose. Let's throw it in the bandsaw and see how it did. What turned out to be the best case scenario, we've got some very sharp action in our 1/4 inch bar and some solid, kind of funky out towards the end, but some good C's in our big bar. With the bars cleaned off, it's time to slap them back together, MIG weld up our sides. I'm not gonna MIG weld all the way around like I did the time before, because these thicker pieces don't bow out quite as much, and I'm not quite as worried about oxygen getting in there. I can tune the forge so there's a lot more fuel getting dumped into it, and so the propane has to come outside the forge to combust since there isn't quite enough oxygen inside the forge for it. This is called a reducing atmosphere, and it's quite nice for sticking steel together. Now, since this is a pretty important part of the pattern, I'm going to go nice and slow underneath the power hammer, drawing it out pretty carefully. The more aggressively I forge it, the more distortion there is in the pattern. And that means that we'll end up getting kind of a bowed out, weird pattern on the top and normal looking pattern in the middle, but we want normal looking pattern as much as possible all throughout it. Inevitably, there's going to be some distortion in the pattern through the forging process just because that's how steel works. With the bar forged down, I'll get it to its final dimensions underneath the press where I have perfectly precise control over my final dimension. And now that it's sized down, it's time to let it cool down and get it ready to chop back up. First things first is I want to test etch the end of the bar. Now, the reason that I do this right now and rather than not later, well, I'll do it later as well, but I want to grind up my bar before throwing it through the bandsaw. Keeping it as a solid bar is going to be the easiest way to keep everything flat and smooth and looking good before we chop it up. So now that I've got a little bit of indexing, I know where things are supposed to be, I can clean off the end of the bar, slab it up into 1-inch long pieces under the bandsaw. Now I cut 12 pieces off, but I'm only gonna be able to use 10 of them because the 12th piece is a little bit short. Now I'll grind the ends of all of my pieces to test etch and see where the pattern sits exactly so that I can very carefully position each and every tile to make sure that the pattern lines up perfectly with the tile next to it. This is especially important with this pattern because the top of the bar looks a little bit different than the bottom of the bar, and we wanna make sure that we go top to top, bottom to bottom, and that'll make the pattern flow the absolute best all the way throughout the whole piece. So we're going to get those welds set underneath the press and then give it a good long soak before pressing it again, and then we're going to let it cool down in the forge because it's nighttime and I'm tired. Well, with the billet cooled down, it's time to grind the MIG welds off the sides. Those big lumpy things get forged real deep into the billet, and it means that you got a lot less usable material unless you grind them off right now. As I ground them off, I noticed that there were a couple of very small, little, light flaws in the forge weld, if you could even call it that. I'm going to throw it back in the fire, throw a little flux on there, and hopefully get those welds closed up as I kind of baby it around underneath the big hammer, trying to get those welds set really, really well. Once my billet is to size, I want to cut a very similar sized block of mild steel and practice forging out this knife before I try it with my fancy schmancy steel, because this is a very complex shape. Getting those lugs drawn out and making them look good is going to be a real pain in the power hammer, but I think I'm pretty confident with how it came out. I'm very glad that I have the Reed 108. With some mild steel jaw covers, it's just the perfect tool for getting those guard lugs drawn out. With that, time to heat up the real billet and hopefully not destroy $100 worth of steel. The first step is to isolate out where the guard lug is going to sit. Right now my billet is 1 3/4 of an inch wide, and the reason that it's nice to start with a wide billet is it means that I can squish in and I don't have to draw out the lugs of the guard quite as far as I would, say, if the billet was thinner. This means that I can isolate material from the get-go a little bit easier. So I want my blade and I want the bottom side of the guard to be a little bit over an inch thick. That'll give me a little bit of room to grind in and a little bit of a biff factor should I hit something improperly with the hammer along the way. Now, I've tried it with a punch, I tried it with a hammer. I like to switch back and forth between the two to get those things drawn out. I want one side to be a little bit wider than the other. I want one side to be about maybe an inch long or so, and the other one to be about 3/8 of an inch. Having these mild steel jaw covers on the Reed 108 really allow me to kind of get after it. This is a bench vise, and so generally they're not really made for heavy hammer work, but having that nice, heavy duty jaws that close parallel, unlike a post vise, makes this job a whole lot easier, and those mild steel jaw covers mean that I'm not scared about messing up the jaws of my vise. With the guard lugs done, I'm going to do what's called a fish mouth weld, wherein you cut a triangle from the very end of the bar and forge weld it back together so that the pattern flows way better in the end of the blade. With that fish mouth weld set, it's time to forge the blade to shape and to forge out our bevels underneath the 25-pound little giant. The rounded out drawing dies I have on the little hammer make forging bevels quite nice. If you guys will remember, it's a double-edged knife, which means that there's an edge on both sides. Go figure that one out. With both bevels forged, the knife is looking good. It's time to whack out the tang real quick and then run this sucker through a couple of thermal cycles. So despite the fact that I started off with 8.5 pounds of steel, I didn't have quite enough for the original plan. That being said, I'm still absolutely thrilled with the proportions and the flow that this thing has. I love that I got that plunge to come straight down above the guard. I like that my guard sits nice and even. I'm just really happy overall. So with that, let's go ahead and start cleaning off some of this forge scale before we hop onto the mill and clean up the top of this, because, well, it's kind of lumpy and we want it to be crispy and square. Let's go give it a shot. I immediately decided not to use the mill since I didn't quite know how to fixture it to get everything straight and square. So I decided to freehand it on the grinder and with files instead. Well, this looks surprisingly good. It did take a significant amount of filing, but overall it's really close. It's a couple thou out over a 2.5 inch span. Now for a hand file, that's pretty accurate. So what I'm gonna do now, take some sandpaper and rub it in some specific spots so that this thing is actually dead flat and it'll look nicer. I'm gonna go ahead and do something a little bit out of the usual for me and make up a couple of cardboard patterns. The pattern for the top of the guard is half of a pattern, so it fits over the ricasso, and then you can trace the line, flip it over, do it on the other side, and then theoretically you have a perfectly shaped guard. I'm also gonna do one to figure out where exactly I want the plunge lines of my grinds to be, because it needs to be the same both sides, and I wanna have a nice radius match front and back. And with that laid out, I head into the grinding room, shape the side profile of my guard, then the top of the guard, and then my plunge lines. With my bevels roughed in at 60 grit, it's time to heat treat this thing. I want to do that while the edge is still fairly thick. We'll let it come up to 1500 degrees and then quench in some Parks 50 quenching oil. So I've preheated the oil to 90 degrees or so. And now, oh shoot, oh crap. Oh, that was bad. Oh, darn it. Well, maybe that hardened. I do not have enough quench oil. I have more quench oil on the way. That was not enough. All right, so the blade hardened, but the guard didn't. So I'm gonna throw it back in the even heat, bring it back up to 1500 degrees and quench it again, but this time I'm gonna have the oil in my vertical tube. The reason that the guard needs to be hardened is since this is Damascus, hardened steel etches different than unhardened steel, and since the guard is also Damascus, it needs to be hardened to etch the same all the way throughout it. There's an issue, and that is that I'm scrapping this knife and starting over. Now that is a really not easy decision to come to, but there is a multitude of problems that kind of one by themselves, they'd probably be pretty okay, but there's enough problems that mean that I would rather restart this project and continue to chase the issues that I'm seeing. The first one, the kicker for it, was during heat treat. I thought this thing got a little bit of a dog leg where the tip had just kicked over a little bit. Not a big deal. There's a handful of different ways to solve that. I actually did a shimmed temper cycle. It's so not even a big deal that I didn't even think to talk about it on camera. But what that dog leg turned out to be in reality was a corkscrew in the blade. So the blade started off straight and then it twists like that, which is a pretty dang hard thing to solve in a hardened, thinly ground knife. Now some of the other issues, right off the bat, I didn't have enough material for the blade that I had planned. I wanted this to be 9.5 inches from the top of the guard to the top of the blade and a little bit wider as well. And this thing is 8.25 inches. It's also 165 thousandths of an inch thick at the spine at the ricasso right here. That's really dang thin for a fighter. I actually really like how it feels. I love how it looks as well. I think this thing looks great. But I was shooting for about 200 thou at the ricasso, but a couple of poorly placed hammer marks kind of right in here meant that I had to grind that thinner to get a good distal taper going. One of the other things is that there's a line of either decarb or maybe MIG bead that runs right up here and then comes back down there. I think it's probably decarb. It would probably etch out just fine, but I don't like the fact that there's some decarb steel on my edge. And the last thing, which really isn't a big deal, but I really wanted this Damascus pattern to be a lot tighter, a lot flamier, with fingers of W's coming out into the blade a lot more aggressively than this kind of bolder, almost tribal looking pattern. I think this pattern looks cool, but it's not what I had planned for the knife. And so this is one of the hardest parts of bladesmithing, is learning when to throw it in the scrap bucket. And so what can happen is it's so easy to chase problems on a knife until you get to your final product and you're not even happy with it because you chased so many problems. And so an important part of bladesmithing is learning when to throw it in the scrap bucket and just get restarted on it. I'm unfortunately not gonna be able to bring this knife with me to Texas, which is the main reason that I was making it. So before any of you comment, no, you can't have it. What you can have are the Scrollwork Bowie t-shirts that are up on my website, done by my friend Evan Watson, who did a gorgeous scrollwork design around a cool Bowie, the first knife that I made in this shop. Make sure to go check those out. Check out the Forge or Die merch on my website. Well, you know what they say, when you fall off the horse, the best thing to do is make a new knife so you can exact your revenge. And we're gonna do that by making another knife. We're gonna make it better. I'm gonna make it exactly how I want it to be, and it's gonna be awesome. Thank you guys so much for following along. I will catch you in the next one.